Most people think that if it's a fruit, it must be healthy. But let me tell you something that very few people know. There is one particular fruit that, when consumed regularly, and especially in the wrong form, can dramatically raise your risk of stroke almost overnight. And here's the shocking part. Most doctors won't tell you this because they assume all fruits are equal. Now, your brain and your arteries are very sensitive to sudden changes in blood sugar and inflammation. When you consume this fruit, you may feel energized at first, but inside your body something very different is happening. Blood sugar spikes, insulin resistance increases, and the blood vessels that supply your brain begin to stiffen and inflame. This is exactly the environment in which strokes occurred. The first key point, the hidden sugar bomb, refers to how one seemingly innocent fruit can create a dangerous environment inside the body, especially when eaten often and in large amounts. Many people believe that because it's fruit, it must automatically be healthy, and to a degree, fruits do contain beneficial compounds like vitamins, antioxidants, and fiber. But the problem is not the nutrients. The problem is the sugar, specifically fructose, which this fruit contains in very high amounts. Unlike glucose, which is handled by many different cells in the body, fructose is processed almost entirely by the liver. That means when you consume this fruit, the sugar load goes straight to one organ, overwhelming it in ways that are invisible at first, but very damaging over time. When the liver is flooded with fructose, it has only a few options: burn it for energy, store it as glycogen, or turn it into fat. The first two are limited, but the third option, turning it into fat, happens almost without limit. That's why excessive fructose consumption leads to fatty liver disease, a silent condition that increases systemic inflammation throughout the body. Once your liver becomes inflamed, the substances it releases circulate in the blood and damage the lining of arteries, including those tiny, delicate vessels in the brain. This process silently raises the risk of plaque formation, clotting, and strokes. Now, think about what happens when you eat this fruit in the form of juice. Instead of getting some fiber to slow down absorption, you're essentially drinking a concentrated sugar solution. This causes a sudden surge of fructose and glucose to hit the bloodstream, overwhelming the liver in a matter of minutes. The liver starts converting this fructose into triglycerides, fat particles that float in the blood. Elevated triglycerides are one of the clearest markers of stroke risk because they thicken the blood and make circulation sluggish. The thicker the blood, the more likely it is to clot. And when a clot forms in an artery that supplies the brain, the result can be catastrophic. This is not a process that takes years to form. Spikes in triglycerides can occur after just one sugar, heavy meal or drink, showing how quickly your physiology shifts when the liver is overloaded. Another overlooked aspect is the metabolic chain reaction that fructose sets off. As the liver produces more fat, insulin sensitivity drops. That means the cells in your body no longer respond efficiently to insulin, so blood sugar stays higher for longer. Insulin resistance is a core feature of type 2 diabetes, but it doesn't appear overnight. It begins silently with small steps, like eating high fructose fruits daily, and gradually builds until the body is in a near constant state of high insulin and high blood sugar. This combination stiffens the arteries, makes blood pressure rise, and primes the body for a stroke. The irony is that someone might believe they're protecting their health by eating more fruit, but in reality, they could be fueling the exact disease process they want to avoid. Let's dig deeper into why fructose specifically is more harmful than other sugars. Glucose is the body's preferred energy source. Muscles can take it up, the brain can burn it directly, and even fat cells can absorb it. But fructose bypasses these usual pathways. It doesn't trigger insulin release in the same way, which might sound good at first, but it also means the body doesn't feel full or satisfied after consuming it. That's why people can drink glass after glass of fruit juice and still feel hungry. They're taking in hundreds of calories of sugar without the normal satiety signals kicking in. This leads to overeating, weight gain, and more fat storage, especially around the belly. Belly fat itself is highly inflammatory and strongly linked to stroke risk. So, in a roundabout way, this fruit not only burdens the liver, but also encourages overeating, fat gain, and all the downstream consequences that damage the brain. The hidden sugar bomb effect becomes worse when the fruit is dried. Drying concentrates the sugar, removing water and fiber, leaving behind small, chewy pieces that are like candy disguised as health food. People can eat a handful of dried fruit without realizing it contains the sugar equivalent of multiple whole fruits. The body doesn't care that the sugar came from something natural. Once inside, it still triggers the same metabolic chaos. Dried fruit spikes blood sugar, raises triglycerides, burdens the liver, and thickens the blood. For someone with existing high blood pressure or atherosclerosis, these sudden changes can be enough to tip the balance toward a stroke event. One of the most deceptive things about this fruit is how harmless it appears. It's often given to children, recommended by dietitians, and sold as part of a balanced breakfast. But what is really happening inside the body is the creation of a metabolic storm. Every time fructose floods the liver, uric acid is also produced as a byproduct. Uric acid is another hidden danger because it not only increases gout risk, but also directly stiffens arteries and raises blood pressure. So now, in addition to fatty liver, high triglycerides, and insulin resistance, you also have higher uric acid damaging blood vessels and stressing the kidneys. All of these mechanisms funnel into one outcome: a brain that is starved of clean, smooth blood flow and an environment primed for clots and strokes. If you consider how the brain depends on a continuous supply of oxygen and nutrients, you start to see why even small disruptions in blood flow are catastrophic. Neurons cannot survive long without oxygen. A stroke isn't just about clogged arteries. It's about starving brain cells of the very fuel they need to function. And this process can be set in motion by something as simple as making fruit juice a daily habit. That's the hidden danger. The sugar bomb doesn't explode in your mouth. It explodes in your bloodstream and silently damages your arteries day after day. For people over 50, the risks are even greater. At this stage of life, blood vessels naturally lose some elasticity, and many individuals already have some degree of insulin resistance or high blood pressure. Adding daily high fructose fruit to the diet is like pouring gasoline on a fire. The body no longer bounces back the way it did in youth, and each sugar spike adds to the cumulative burden on the arteries. The scary part is that this damage builds without obvious symptoms until one day a clot forms and cuts off circulation to the brain. That's why strokes often seem to come out of nowhere, but in truth, they were being prepared silently for years. To truly grasp how dangerous this hidden sugar bomb can be, imagine it like rust forming inside a pipe. Each serving of this fruit adds another layer of corrosion inside the arteries, narrowing them just a little more, making blood flow just a little harder. Eventually, it only takes one more spike, one more surge of sugar and triglycerides for the pipe to clog completely. That's when disaster strikes, and by then, it's too late to reverse the damage instantly. Prevention is the only real strategy, and prevention means recognizing the hidden danger in what you eat daily. This is why it's so critical to view fruit not as universally safe, but as something that must be chosen carefully and consumed with awareness. Low glycemic fruits, rich in fiber and antioxidants, but lower in sugar, can support brain health. But high fructose fruits, especially in juice or dried form, act as ticking time bombs inside the bloodstream. The liver cannot handle the overload, the arteries cannot withstand the repeated insult, and the brain cannot survive without smooth, steady blood flow. Once you see this clearly, the idea that fruit equals health becomes too simplistic and even dangerous. The hidden sugar bomb must be diffused before it silently sets off a stroke. The second key point focuses on insulin resistance and high blood pressure, and how a fruit that many people believe is healthy can silently push the body toward these two dangerous conditions, setting the stage for a stroke. At first glance, the sugar inside fruit seems harmless compared to refined sugar, but the body doesn't make that distinction. When this fruit is eaten regularly, especially in the concentrated forms like juice or dried fruit, it floods the bloodstream with sugar in a very short period of time. Each time this happens, the pancreas must release insulin to bring that sugar under control and shuttle it into the cells. For a while, the body can handle it, but the more often you repeat the cycle, the more the cells stop listening to insulin's message. This is called insulin resistance, and it is one of the biggest drivers of not just diabetes, but also strokes. When your body becomes resistant to insulin, blood sugar lingers in the bloodstream instead of being absorbed efficiently. This extra sugar is highly damaging to blood vessels. It acts like tiny shards of glass scraping the delicate inner lining of your arteries. The lining, known as the endothelium, is supposed to stay smooth so blood can flow freely. But when it is damaged by repeated sugar spikes, it becomes rough and inflamed. Once that inflammation takes hold, cholesterol and other particles in the blood can stick to the artery wall more easily, beginning the process of plaque buildup. Over time, these plaques narrow the arteries, raise blood pressure, and increase the risk of clot formation. In the brain, a clot can cut off blood flow in an instant, leading to stroke. It's important to realize that insulin itself plays a role in raising blood pressure. When insulin levels are constantly elevated, as they are in insulin resistance, the body retains more sodium and water. This extra fluid in the bloodstream pushes against the walls of arteries, increasing pressure. At the same time, high insulin stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, which raises heart rate and constricts blood vessels, adding even more strain. Now, the arteries feeding the brain are not only inflamed and damaged, but also under higher pressure, making them more likely to rupture or become blocked. This dual hit, endothelial damage and increased pressure, is what makes insulin resistance such a silent but deadly risk factor for stroke. Think about the way this happens in daily life. Someone wakes up and drinks a glass of fruit juice with breakfast, thinking they're doing something healthy. That juice contains the sugar equivalent of several pieces of whole fruit, hitting the bloodstream all at once. Blood sugar rises sharply, insulin surges to push it down, and within a short while, blood sugar drops again, leaving the person craving more food. They reach for a snack, often another fruit or something sweet, repeating the cycle. Each time the pancreas pumps out more insulin, and each time the cells respond a little less. Years of this pattern create a metabolic environment where blood sugar is consistently high, insulin is consistently high, and blood pressure begins to creep up. By the time symptoms appear, fatigue, belly fat, foggy thinking, the damage to arteries has already begun. The brain is particularly vulnerable in this scenario because its blood vessels are much smaller and more delicate than the large arteries in the rest of the body. Even slight increases in pressure or small clots can disrupt blood flow. The more resistant the body becomes to insulin, the more pressure builds up in these fragile vessels. At some point, the pressure may become too much, causing a vessel to burst, or a clot may lodge in a narrowed artery, cutting off blood supply. Both situations are catastrophic and can happen without warning. That's why stroke is often called a silent killer. Another hidden danger of insulin resistance is that it promotes fat storage, especially around the midsection. Belly fat is not just an energy reserve, it's a hormonally active tissue that pumps out inflammatory chemicals. These chemicals further damage the arteries and worsen blood pressure regulation. It's a vicious cycle. The fruit sugar drives insulin resistance. Insulin resistance drives fat gain drives inflammation, and inflammation accelerates damage to the arteries. Each turn of the cycle pushes the risk of stroke higher. Some people believe that because fruit is natural, the body can handle it better than processed sugar. But when fruit is consumed in unnatural amounts, like in juice form, the body doesn't distinguish much between that and soda. In fact, the fructose in fruit can be even more damaging than glucose in terms of insulin resistance because it promotes fat buildup in the liver. A fatty liver is a hallmark of insulin resistance, and it contributes to rising blood pressure by releasing inflammatory proteins and failing to regulate blood fats properly. This is why people with fatty liver disease often also have hypertension and are at much higher risk of stroke. What makes this even more deceptive is that insulin resistance and high blood pressure often develop silently. You don't feel high insulin levels in your body. You don't notice your arteries stiffening or your endothelial lining breaking down. You may not feel high blood pressure until it's already dangerously elevated. That's why people are often shocked when they're told by their doctor that they have prediabetes or hypertension, even though they thought they were eating healthy. The reality is that a steady intake of high sugar fruit is enough to create this internal environment without any outward signs for years. Over time, the constant strain on the arteries forces the heart to pump harder to push blood through narrowed, inflamed vessels. This enlarges the heart muscle and wears it down, creating another stroke risk factor. The brain, meanwhile, becomes less and less protected. Small blockages, called mini strokes or TIAs, may happen along the way as warnings, but many people ignore them or don't even notice them. Then, one day, a major blockage occurs, cutting off a significant portion of the brain's blood supply. The tragic part is that this chain of events often starts with something as simple as making fruit juice or dried fruit part of the daily diet. The connection between insulin resistance, high blood pressure, and stroke risk cannot be overstated. Once you understand that the body treats fruit sugar almost the same way it treats table sugar, you begin to see how even natural foods can become harmful when consumed the wrong way. The key is moderation and choosing fruits that are lower in sugar and higher in fiber, rather than relying on high fructose options that strain the liver, raise insulin, and elevate blood pressure. Protecting your brain means protecting your blood vessels, and that starts with controlling what fuels you give your body every single day. The third key point is about the thickening of the blood and poor circulation that follows frequent consumption of a fruit rich in fructose. This is not something most people consider when they think about diet. We often think of sugar in terms of weight gain, energy spikes, or diabetes, but rarely do we connect it with the consistency of blood itself and the way blood moves through the body, especially the brain. Yet this is exactly what happens when high amounts of fructose enter the system. The liver, overwhelmed by the sugar load, begins to produce triglycerides, which are fat molecules that circulate in the blood. When triglycerides are elevated, the blood becomes thicker, almost like oil mixed into water. This makes it more difficult for blood to flow smoothly, particularly through the tiny capillaries that feed brain cells with oxygen and nutrients. Thick blood is sluggish blood, and sluggish blood is much more prone to clotting. The presence of clots in circulation is what turns a hidden problem into a sudden, devastating stroke. To understand how this develops, you have to picture the bloodstream like a river. When the water is clear and free-flowing, it nourishes everything along its banks. But if you dump waste, sludge, and debris into the river, the water slows down, becomes murky, and eventually clogs. That is exactly what happens when triglycerides rise. The once free, flowing blood that could easily pass through arteries now struggles. The more fat particles suspended in the blood, the harder the heart has to work to push it forward, and the more likely those particles are to stick to the walls of arteries. Over time, these sticky deposits create plaque, narrowing the vessel further and further. What begins as poor circulation can escalate into blocked arteries. When those arteries supply the brain, it only takes one clot lodging in a narrowed passage to cut off life, giving oxygen to millions of neurons, causing instant and sometimes irreversible damage. This is not a distant or rare phenomenon. After just one meal rich in sugar or fruit juice, triglycerides in the blood can spike significantly for several hours. During that time, the blood is thicker and more inflammatory. Imagine repeating this meal pattern daily or multiple times a day for years. The liver keeps churning out more triglycerides, the blood stays thicker more often, and circulation deteriorates. Over time, small vessels in the brain, the ones responsible for nourishing delicate regions that control memory, speech, or movement, are starved. The person may notice brain fog, slower thinking, or occasional dizziness, not realizing these are early warning signs of poor circulation to the brain. The situation worsens because thick blood not only clogs arteries, but also strains the heart. The heart must pump harder to move this viscous blood, and the increased pressure raises the chance of arterial walls being damaged. Damaged walls invite plaque buildup, and plaque buildup invites clot formation. This vicious cycle keeps feeding itself, with fructose as the spark that sets it in motion. What is alarming is how silent the process is. People believe they are doing something healthy by consuming fruit juice or dried fruit, unaware that they are fueling triglyceride spikes and thickening their blood day after day. By the time a stroke happens, the problem has been developing for years under the surface. One overlooked aspect of thick blood is that it reduces oxygen delivery. Even when blood is moving, if it is heavy with triglycerides, its oxygen carrying capacity is reduced. This means the brain receives less oxygen with each heartbeat. Neurons are extremely sensitive. They begin to die within minutes without adequate oxygen. Even small, repeated reductions in oxygen delivery over time impair cognitive function. That is why people with chronically high triglycerides often complain of fatigue, poor concentration, and memory problems. These are not simply annoyances, they are red flags of reduced brain circulation that, if left unaddressed, can culminate in a stroke. The danger is compounded when high triglycerides combine with other lifestyle factors like dehydration, lack of movement, or high blood pressure. Dehydration further thickens the blood by reducing plasma volume. Lack of exercise means blood is not being circulated efficiently. High blood pressure means the thickened blood is being forced through fragile vessels with more pressure than they can safely handle. Each of these amplifies the risk of clot formation and vascular rupture. What seems like a simple dietary choice, eating or drinking too much of one fruit, becomes the trigger that sets off a complex web of dangerous physiological changes. Consider the arteries of the brain again. They are narrow and winding, designed to deliver precise amounts of blood to highly specialized regions. They cannot tolerate sludge in the system. When the blood is thickened by triglycerides, clots can form spontaneously in areas of slow flow. Once formed, those clots can travel and lodge in critical areas, shutting off circulation instantly. This is why strokes often happen suddenly and without warning. The person might feel fine one moment, then unable to speak, move, or think clearly the next. The chain of events began long before, but the catastrophe unfolds in seconds. Another issue is that thickened blood makes the body less efficient at clearing waste. The brain produces metabolic waste constantly, and efficient circulation is required to remove it. Poor circulation slows this clearance, allowing toxins to accumulate in the brain. This not only increases stroke risk, but also accelerates cognitive decline and increases the risk of neurodegenerative diseases. So the problem is not just acute events like stroke, but also chronic, progressive decline in brain function. The very fruit that people believe is protecting their health may, in excess, be undermining their brain's long-term survival. When you think about it, the picture becomes clear. Fructose raises triglycerides. Triglycerides thicken the blood. Thick blood clogs vessels. Clogged vessels starve the brain. It is a straight line from one to the other, and yet most people are unaware of it. They are told that fruit is safe, that natural sugar is harmless, and that juice is a wholesome part of breakfast. They never connect their habit of drinking juice or snacking on dried fruit with their rising triglycerides on blood tests, their creeping blood pressure, or their bouts of fatigue and brain fog. By the time the connection is obvious, the damage has already been done. This is why prevention is so critical. The brain depends on smooth, free-flowing blood for its survival. Every choice you make about what you eat and drink influences the quality of that blood. When you choose foods high in fructose, you thicken the blood and sabotage circulation. When you choose foods low in sugar and high in nutrients, you support clean, efficient blood flow and protect your brain. The difference may determine whether you experience a long, sharp, active life or a sudden, devastating stroke that changes everything overnight. The fourth key point deals with the overlooked effect of dehydration and potassium depletion that can follow excessive consumption of high sugar fruit, and how this silently increases the risk of stroke. On the surface, fruit seems like the perfect hydration food. It is juicy, refreshing, and often recommended for hot days or after exercise. But the truth is that the type of sugar contained in this fruit, primarily fructose, actually creates an internal environment that leads to dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, particularly lowering potassium. This is where the real danger lies, because potassium is one of the body's most critical minerals for maintaining proper fluid balance, stabilizing blood pressure, and keeping the brain and heart functioning smoothly. When potassium levels fall, sodium levels effectively rise, blood vessels constrict, and blood pressure climbs higher. The brain, sitting at the end of this chain, bears the brunt of this pressure increase. Over time, the risk of stroke rises dramatically, and it can happen suddenly, seemingly without warning. To understand how this works, you have to look at what happens in the body when fructose is metabolized. Unlike glucose, which is used by many tissues in the body, fructose is processed primarily in the liver. The breakdown of fructose consumes large amounts of ATP, the energy currency of the cell. As ATP is depleted, uric acid is produced as a byproduct. Elevated uric acid levels interfere with the body's ability to retain potassium while encouraging sodium retention. That shift alone begins to create an imbalance in electrolytes. Sodium pulls water with it, leading to water retention in some tissues while actually depleting fluid from others. What this means is that even though someone may feel they are hydrating by eating a sweet fruit or drinking its juice, inside the body, potassium is being lost and fluid balance is being disrupted. The end result is a paradox. The more of this fruit you consume, the greater your risk of silent dehydration and low potassium, two major stroke triggers. Potassium is critical for the relaxation of blood vessel walls. It works in balance with sodium to control vascular tone. When potassium is abundant, blood vessels stay flexible and pressure remains stable. When potassium drops, sodium dominates, tightening blood vessels and pushing blood pressure higher. Now imagine this effect in the brain. The arteries and capillaries there are narrow, fragile, and highly sensitive to pressure changes. A drop in potassium makes them constrict. A rise in sodium makes them stiff, and both effects combine to raise the risk of rupture or blockage. A single high, sugar fruit binge may not cause noticeable symptoms, but over weeks and months, this imbalance chips away at vascular health, preparing the ground for a catastrophic event. The dehydration effect worsens the problem. High sugar intake draws water out of cells through osmosis. This is why people who consume large amounts of sugary foods often feel thirstier even though they are technically taking in liquid. Their cells are drying out as water shifts into the bloodstream to dilute the excess sugar. If the sugar load is chronic, this creates a continuous cycle of dehydration at the cellular level. The brain, which is 75% water, cannot afford this. Even mild dehydration reduces blood volume, making circulation less efficient and increasing blood viscosity. Combined with low potassium, this is the perfect storm, thickened blood pushing through constricted vessels under elevated pressure. All of these conditions converge on the brain to make stroke risk dangerously high. Another overlooked role of potassium is its influence on nerve signaling. Every thought, every movement, every heartbeat relies on electrical impulses controlled by the balance of sodium and potassium across cell membranes. When potassium levels drop, electrical signaling becomes unstable. The heart may beat irregularly, the brain may misfire, and muscle coordination may falter. Irregular heartbeats, or arrhythmias, are themselves risk factors for stroke because they encourage the formation of clots in the heart that can travel to the brain. So the danger is not just localized to the arteries of the brain, but also systemic. Potassium depletion disrupts electrical rhythm, raises blood pressure, thickens blood, and sets multiple pathways towards stroke in motion at once. People often overlook this because they equate fruit with potassium itself. Yes, many fruits are good sources of potassium, but the problem is that the very sugar inside certain fruits accelerates potassium loss in the urine and undermines its protective effect. Drinking fruit juice may provide some potassium, but the simultaneous sugar spike robs the body of more potassium than the juice delivers. This is why populations with high intakes of sugary fruits and fruit juices often still have widespread potassium deficiencies, despite their diets appearing healthy on the surface. What looks good on the outside does not always translate into protection inside the body. The irony is even greater when you consider that potassium is one of the most powerful natural protectors against stroke. Studies consistently show that people with high dietary potassium have lower risks of hypertension and cerebrovascular events. Potassium relaxes vessels, lowers pressure, improves circulation, and balances sodium. But when sugar interferes with this balance, the protective shield is stripped away, leaving the arteries exposed. Every time a sugary fruit is eaten in excess, the shield gets thinner until eventually it fails. That failure is what a stroke represents, the final breakdown of vascular balance under The combined stress of dehydration, sodium dominance, and potassium depletion, you can see how this plays out in daily routines. Someone might start the day with fruit juice, thinking it is hydrating. They feel temporarily refreshed, but inside, their sugar load has pulled water out of their cells, spiked insulin, and begun depleting potassium. Later in the day, they snack on dried fruit or another serving of the same fruit. The same cycle repeats. By evening, they may feel tired, thirsty, or even slightly lightheaded, not realizing these are signals of electrolyte imbalance. Over months, this routine ingrains a chronic state of low potassium and dehydration, raising blood pressure slowly but surely. One day, under stress, or with an additional factor like heat or exertion, the imbalance pushes the body past its threshold and a stroke occurs. The brain does not give many warnings when it comes to electrolyte imbalance. Unlike other organs, it cannot store nutrients for long, and it relies on constant, steady blood flow. The combination of dehydration and potassium depletion is like tightening a noose around its oxygen supply. You may feel subtle symptoms, muscle cramps, irregular heartbeat, mental fog, or fatigue, but these are often dismissed or attributed to age or stress. Meanwhile, the real danger is building silently beneath the surface. The lesson here is that not all hydration is true hydration, and not all fruit is protective just because it is natural. The balance of electrolytes is more important than the immediate refreshment you feel. Low sugar, mineral-rich foods and fluids actually hydrate the body at the cellular level and support brain health. High sugar fruits do the opposite. They create the illusion of hydration while robbing the body of potassium, concentrating sodium, thickening blood, and stressing arteries. Stroke risk is not the result of one factor alone, but the convergence of many small imbalances, and this fruit contributes to nearly all of them at once. The more you see how potassium governs blood pressure, circulation, and nerve health, the more clearly you understand why this mineral is the ultimate key to stroke prevention. Any habit that depletes it is dangerous. No matter how healthy it looks from the outside, eating this fruit daily or in large quantities is like quietly draining your brain's protective battery, leaving it vulnerable when pressure mounts. When the balance is finally tipped, the result is sudden, life-altering, and often irreversible. That is why the connection between this fruit, dehydration, potassium loss, and stroke cannot be ignored.